Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm your host, John Fortney, the Director of Communication for the Senate Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus in the Ohio Senate. Joining us this week, Senate President Matt Huffman, Republican from Lima, and rolling out a major report on reforming housing in the state of Ohio, a great news conference that she chaired as also the chairperson of the Select Committee on Housing, State Senator Michele Reynolds, a Republican from Canal Winchester. Welcome.
Thank you, John.
Really nice press conference, about an hour, and right here is the report. Housing Reimagined, building a solid foundation for the future of Ohio. 94 pages in this, and it's built really on a very strong foundation of the hearings that were held around the state of Ohio. It was Cleveland, Cincinnati, Lima, and Marietta, which all featured a unique set of challenges when it came to housing that really in many ways was mutually exclusive to that area. Tell me a little bit about why this was an important report to really launch into that took several months to develop.
So it's just really an important conversation that we need to have in the state of Ohio, because we realize that we've been experiencing housing challenges for quite some time. And we know that we have a lack of supply of housing, especially in our urban cities, but we're also losing population in our rural communities. And so with us growing as a state, especially with our economic boom and all of the forecast of people moving to Ohio, we know that we have to address this issue.
It was also important to take the show on the road, so to speak, Mr. President. One of the hearings was in Lima. And do you think that provided really unique and significant input into the report itself?
Yeah, I think there's a different group of people when you're in different cities. I mean, let's face it, when you're in Columbus, there's advocates who their job is to come and testify. People are used to coming here. I thought it was unique, for example, in Lima, we have lots of proposed government solutions. One of our speakers got up and said he's remodeled 3 buildings in the city of Lima, all on his own dime, no government tax abatement, anything else, and has provided a couple of hundred units in downtown Lima at market rates. All of them are full. And so, one of the things we wanted to do is say there are some programs that are necessary, because the free market doesn't usually work for the bottom 10% of the population, or maybe even 20%. But most of the time, free market does. So that particular person and other folks are saying, well, here's how it's working in my town. And I think that was very helpful.
One of the things that we heard too, like in the more rural areas from the hearing that was held in Marietta, was that there does not seem to be a significant interest, if at all at times, from major developers to come in and build in more rural areas. A lot of it's topography, geography, just a lack of being able to build the volume that you would want to build for the developer to get their money out of it, or to make the money that they think that they should be making. Was that something that was interesting to you, that you put up there as like, oh, well, that's something that we should be considering?
Yes, we heard a lot of that in the rural communities, that is a challenge, that they don't have developers that even want to develop there. And we've heard from the development community saying, well, first of all, it's too expensive. With the LIHTC program, there's not, it doesn't score well, first of all, with the way the criteria is, but there's also a gap in bond financing and a match that's required that the locals cannot afford. And so because of that, the housing development community doesn't want to come out there and build.
And as you were saying, Lima has its own unique challenges. I think one of the things that was said during the Lima hearing was the overall average age of the home inventory that would be a viable product to sell somewhere in the early 1960s. I was thinking mid-1960s was the average age of homes there.
Sure. And as a person who lives in a 100-year-old house and practices law in a 120-year-old building, I don't know that age necessarily is going to say it's a good place or not. There are a lot of homes that were quickly constructed, poorly constructed, and early in the century in Lima on the south side because of the manufacturing plants. But there are also, and Lima is perhaps a microcosm of larger cities like Cleveland or Cincinnati, a lot of old houses that are really well constructed. Oftentimes there's empty lots beside them. And what we tried to do a little bit of this in the budget, but reinvigorating those neighborhoods to say, let's let homeowner or home builders know if the free market comes here with incentives, they can make a profit participating in this. And I'll say this, as I've said on a variety of occasions, places, the urban areas, and I'm speaking certainly on behalf of Lima, but much bigger urban areas, they already have the infrastructure to build. They have streets, curb cuts, water, storm sewer, sanitary sewer, electrical. All of those things are in place. So globally, the tax dollar is saved. Now, a lot of folks say, well, I don't want to live there. I want to live someplace else. And certainly I think homeowners or home builders can say, I can make a lot more money building $1 million house than a bunch of $200,000 houses, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Right. And if you look at Central Ohio as well, you see the expansion in the suburbs, a lot of the subdivisions, which it's relatively easy to run water and sewer off an existing tap point into the next adjacent horse or farm field. And some of the other areas don't have the ability to do that.
Yeah, it's and what we're, this particular topic is a slice of what this whole situation or a whole set of issues are about. There's not a shortage of people who want to build expensive homes and sell them. But if there are government regulations that we can change to look at people and say, if I can do it this way, I can make money building, and we all want to use the right word, affordable or middle income or low end, but a $150,000 house and multiple of those, which that's a goal. And by the way, this is what happened in the post-World War II era. If you look in every, my son used to have a house like this in Madeira. They're all over West Lima. The little red brick Lego houses with a little white, and those houses were built by the thousands, the millions actually. My daughter has one in Bethesda, Maryland. Now people have added on to the back of them, but no one builds those right now because the margin isn't big enough, and a lot of that is because the government has removed the margin through regulation.
It's a good point. And when we talk about affordable housing, as you were saying, affordable housing can mean many different things to a variety of people. When we see some of the low-income housing that has been projects in more metropolitan areas, should that not also come with an understanding that we don't want people to always be living and feel like that's where you're always going to be?
Absolutely.
In that new low-income housing building,
Right.
that over a certain amount of time, as it even came up during the news conference, where Columbus has had problems with that and has had to shut some of these facilities down.
That's really
So the message is that, yes, we don't want people to be homeless, but this is not your last stop. We want you to be ambitious and looking forward to the next place.
I think that's a great point, John, because we want to encourage people for upward mobility. And we want to meet people where they are currently, but there are levels to this, and that's why we build starter homes. Starter homes are specifically that, starter homes. And so when you first start out with a family, maybe that's good for you now, but we're hoping that with education and employment opportunities and all of the wonderful economic things that we're bringing here to Ohio, that people will be able to level up. And at that point, they still need housing that's affordable. That doesn't necessarily mean they need low-income housing. They need housing that meets their need at the level that they are.
That is one of the things that you were referencing about the small brick homes that were built, and maybe part of the model of what we saw with Habitat for Humanity. Would you rather be renting in a low-income apartment complex, maybe not knowing who your neighbors are, or would you rather own your own small starter home with your own sweat equity to get in the door?
Right.
Yeah, and just getting in slightly into another conversation, this is one of the things we've talked about generational wealth. That's largely passed down through real estate, through houses. Somebody pays off their mortgage, they sell their house, they have cash at the end of their life for retirement or other things like that. Now, a lot of generational wealth transfer for folks is their 401k, but it's a way. If you own a home, you can create generational wealth. And that's something that has probably was true for a lot of more people 50 or 60 years ago, but has gone away as government has decided, here's how we're going to solve the housing problem. Those are some of the things we're trying to change.
I agree with that. I think that the conversation around affordable housing gets lost on just the premise that it's all about renting. And we really need to get back to increasing homeownership opportunities because that's truly the American dream. We're not renting the dream, we're trying to own the dream.
I'm sorry.
No, and so I just believe that with some of the initiatives that we're trying to do, and look, the state of Ohio already invests a lot of resources around this problem. We just need to make sure that we're doing the right things and looking at how we can make those investments and have desired outcomes. But really, a big push of this is to increase homeownership.
How big of an issue, and this is something that did come up during the committee hearing. I remember in Cleveland when I went to that hearing, a retired teacher whose home had been paid off for probably 2 decades had to turn for help because she was concerned about her property taxes going up exponentially to the point where if you're on fixed income, people are wondering, how am I going to pay my property taxes and am I going to lose my home? And this is something I know that the Senate has addressed, at least sort of a short-term answer to that. Where do you think the state, what is the message about this valuation issue?
Well, as I mentioned on a variety of occasions, there's 2 sides to the ledger. One is revenue and one is cost. And it's easy, essentially, in a valuation process to say, here's how much money we need to raise. Here's what the levy allows. We don't think the public's going to vote in favor of it. So your $400,000 house is now worth $600,000 while all the money is there. That's not a voted on tax. We've streamlined somewhat the valuation process and the objections to that. But for most people, it's like, there it is, pay the money. And there's, practically speaking, very difficult to change it. If you got the money to challenge the system, you can. We have to begin looking at the costs. We have to begin looking at, and we have increased spending extraordinarily among local taxing entities, particularly public schools, the last 20 years. We've increased spending adjusted for inflation 50%. That's before the record increases in the 21 and 23 budgets. So, the answer is, and this includes in high wealth districts, folks just aren't going to vote for a levy anymore. And there's the cost side, and it's not just a public school issue either. We have, if you look comparatively to the number of local political entities we have in the state of Ohio compared to a state like New York, it's like 5 or 6 times as many. Someone told me recently there's 54 cities in Cuyahoga County. Now, are all those going to go out and say, you know what, let's cut the cost of? No, they're not going to do that. But that doesn't mean that they can just continually raise valuations and collect more money. Because, and tax increases of this kind, like most government policies, that are many government policies, I should say, they affect the most vulnerable people in our society. If taxes go up and it's, for a guy who's got a lot of money, he can say, I'm not happy about it, but I can pay it. Other people lose their house.
Right. And we've said it over and over that from our standpoint, we believe it's your money first, not the government. And that's on it. One of the things, too, you make some fundamental recommendations within the report, having a housing dashboard.
Yeah.
What is a housing dashboard?
So a housing dashboard is essentially a one-stop shop where we will be able to monitor and analyze some of the key metrics of data related to the Ohio's housing market. So if you remember in 2020 when COVID hit our nation, the governor actually came out with his 2 p.m. press conferences, and he would show this lovely dashboard about what's going on with the state of affairs as it relates to COVID, vaccinations, and things like that. And so really it would kind of mirror that same sort of system, because we need to know that based on all of the things that we're doing, what is working. And so if we can actually have a dashboard that actually informs our decisions so that we can have good policy, then we'll know that the things that we're doing are working, and maybe we need to adjust that up or down. But otherwise, we're creating resources, we're putting money out there, but we don't quite know if it's meeting our needs.
One of the things too that I thought was interesting, and I had asked what it was, one of the staff members, but you've heard of NIMBY. You're not in my backyard. You'd like to promote within the recommendations of the report YIMBY.
Yeah.
YIMBY, what is YIMBY?
So YIMBY is yes in my backyard. And I know that for the most part, housing is a local issue. This is where it really, the rubber meets the road in your local community. And so we want to just kind of set Ohio's landscape as being a pro-housing state because we are welcoming people to the state of Ohio. We want you to work here, but where are you going to live? Homes are where jobs goes at night. And so we want to make sure that people feel welcome here and that they can live here. And so yes, in my backyard is just the state's attempt to have a messaging campaign like Ohio Find It Here, that you can actually live, work, and play in Ohio. And I think that will help our local government partners be able to set some more messaging in their local communities to make it a little easier when they have to do things like develop and grow in their local community.
And so when you read this report, Housing Reimagined, Building a Solid Foundation for Ohio's Future, this was constructed and built from testimony that you received around the entire state.
That's right.
Correct. It was interesting that in the Columbus Dispatch this week, Bill Bush, who's a longtime reporter there, put out a story that says the headline is, Columbus pushes massive zoning overhaul. City hires PR firm to bolster public support. The Dispatch review there was a behind the scenes effort that included the firm writing an emotional draft letter to the editor on behalf of a supposed member of the public. And one of the documents uncovered said, if we can speed up our review and permitting process, it will be great news for affordable housing development for our emerging developers. And this all came at an initial cost of $260,000, more than $250,000. I thought that there would be some communications people, PR people that could help craft that within the city of Columbus, within their expansive budget. But I just wanted to be on the record as saying this was a product of the Senate committee. What's your thoughts when you hear things like that hiring a PR campaign or a PR firm to try to craft a strategy? I was surprised to see that.
Well, yeah, first of all, as I've mentioned a couple of times here, Senator Reynolds, who's did the bulk of work on this, and the other senators who traveled the state and have done this, like other communities, there's not extra pay or bonus or anything like that. This is something that she took upon herself, and so that's part one. And part two, one of the things that you see often in government, and it's not just on statements about what we would like. We see it on when we spend money. There's a phenomenon where we say, hey, we're going to put $5 million towards fill in the blank. And we have a press conference and we say, look at what we're doing, or 10 million or 100 million. And it's going to go for initiatives that will help with that. And everybody shakes their hands, they walk out of the room. And is there ever really a report later on the efficacy of all of that? And I know I'm getting off topic here, but because we spend doesn't mean we change things, that we help the situation, that we're actually doing something. And, this was done to come up with some very substantial, I think, solutions. Some of them are relatively simple, like, oh yeah, why aren't we already doing that kind of thing? But also to create a structure over the next 5 to 10 years about how we can change things. I think that, I sometimes I use the phrase, I don't mind spending money. I hate wasting money. Sometimes I mind spending money if you don't have it. But I think that this is really a great blueprint for what we're going to be doing.
It gets back to what we were talking about earlier about affordable housing or low-income housing. Are we working at the behest of the developers based on what the city of Columbus and the dispatch story was pointing out, based on the quote, or are we really trying to provide a framework for people to build wealth and to own something, to own their own home in Ohio?
Absolutely. That's exactly what we're trying to do. And so, it's a plan that's a model to develop that framework for housing policy, future conversation around this. It's a call to action, if you will. There's something in here that I'm sure everybody cares about, and they can take up the mantle and move forward on that. But it is a worthwhile conversation that needs to be had. I'm pleased to say that this was an inside job, that we used our own resources. Even the full color print of this was done in-house by our IT printing staff. And so we just used all the resources that we have in-house, and I'm happy to say that we wasted nothing, and we pulled our resources together and we got it done.
Housing making headlines, childcare, access to childcare continues to make headlines in Ohio. What do you think? We covered a little bit about this in our podcast last week about what the governor was talking about regarding childcare. Have there been any new developments? Because you made a great point last week in the podcast that you can throw all the money at it and, have all kinds of programs that spend lots of money. But if there's not a place for kids to go and parents to send their children, then it's worthless.
Yeah, eligibility is one question, funding is one question, but there has to be capacity. And, as I've mentioned several times, we, with the various government regulations, including Step Up to Quality, when that was initiated as a future program in 2012, out of 6,000 small daycare centers, 4,000 of them closed. And, that's, up to 6 kids in those. Well, that's, 24,000 kids, and not necessarily 24,000 families, because some of this. So, and we provided money in the last budget to reach out to people and to essentially recruit. Let's get these, and especially some of that are reopened. Places like Allen County, they're doing a great job. But you can't just say we have a program if anybody, which you have to go talk to people. And I actually met with a group, essentially a vendor group, that wants to say, we'll go do that. We'll take this money and we'll go do it. So, I'm encouraged that we're largely on the same page now. I met with the director and we talked about the capacity issue. I think Governor DeWine understands that too now.
But as we also said, parents don't necessarily want to or need to send their child to a preschool certified childcare. Often they would just like to be able, on their way to work, mom and dad on their way to work, would like a place for their child to be safe and fed when they come back to get them.
Absolutely.
So it's not a one size.
Well, I think so. Like a lot of things, they want someplace that's safe, that's healthy, and of course all of those things have to be in place. But also knowing the people who are doing this. And the bigger any place is, the bigger the school, the harder it is for the family to know that. But if where you're taking your children is to your mom's house, and she's also watching 3 or 4 other kids, and it's 2 doors down, that's what they want. Oh, the only center that's open now is 4 miles away. I got to drive there. And by the way, if there's an outbreak of measles or something like that, they're closing down for 2 weeks, and what do I do then? If my child's at, my mom isn't going to tell me, well, we're not going to take, so it's just having a smaller, more nimble system works better in so many different ways.
Speaking of children, there was a Franklin County Common Pleas Court judge that put, I believe, a 10-day stay on the enactment of House Bill 68. And one of the stories reporting that this week, I thought pointed out at the end of the story, it was from Sarah Donaldson from State News, who they work out of the State House. The paragraph, next to the last paragraph, says the ACLU, who is arguing for the stay in the case, the ACLU has also cited the recently ratified Issue 1, which codified abortion rights in the state constitution as something that extends the potential protection of gender-affirming care. House Bill 68 basically prohibits radical sex change operations and other hormone-based therapy that can be life-altering and permanent for children in Ohio. And when we had you on one of our earlier podcasts that we pushed back on the Associated Press, a national Associated Press story that was really a hit piece, saying that what we published, one of your columns about issue 1 at the time, said it was totally wrong. It was totally erroneous. And we heard from the ACLU and all these other organizations that said, no, issue 1 doesn't deal with gender affirming care in children, but apparently it does now in the court. What do you think about that? I mean, to me, and I'll say it, what a bunch of liars.
Well, I mean, we've seen the hypocrisy before, and so I'm not surprised by that. And the narrative changes to reflect when, it's helpful for them, but when it's not, then, they use it against us. So I'm not surprised.
Dave Yost, as we talked last week, is confident that this will be on our side, a win for children and protecting children. And he pointed out in the National Review column that we talked about that one of the reasons probably why this was filed in state court was because a federal judge has already ruled on a similar Tennessee law that says, yeah, this is constitutional.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I reject the phrase gender affirming care, which looks like that was hatched in a think laboratory someplace.
Yeah.
Surgery on a confused child in perhaps, which may be okay with at least one of their confused parents. This is something we're going to look back on years to come as how could this society allow that? And there's things that we look back on the history. I'll talk about that in some other podcasts. Things that were proved medically, approved by institutions of higher education that this is the way this has to be. And now we look at it and say, well, that's ludicrous. I mean, that actually happened once. So we'll be looking back at this now. And so it is a problem, I mentioned this today, that we have a single elected judge in one county that can set aside the actions of the General Assembly in making law. And we don't know how long this temporary restraining order will last. The one regarding the heartbeat law, the temporary restraining order went on. Typically, and I've been involved in a number of injunctive actions in court, typically the restraining order is so that you can get to a trial and have it. If the restraining order is indefinite, then, in fact, it's one elected judge, one place, controlling the narrative for 11 million people.
How would you make that immediately then appealable to a higher court or to the state Supreme Court?
Yeah, to the state Supreme Court, but obviously not in every situation, but in a situation where you have a duly enacted, constitutionally enacted law by the members of the General Assembly. And I appreciate that the governor vetoed it, or enough people to override that veto. That's one person deciding for everything. I don't think that's the intention of a republic in a democratic style government.
And there also is the executive order in place under the Ohio Administrative Code that takes effect next month regarding prohibiting these types of procedures for children that was put in place by the Department of Health and the DeWine administration. But isn't it interesting how the definition of terms, you brought up the whole gender affirming care, which doesn't affirm one's birth gender whatsoever, but also the definition of, you hear it and it's how you read it in every article as well about trans kids, these trans kids. Well, really, we're talking about children, minors, little boys and little girls suffering from a behavioral disorder. And we're also seeing European countries now basically taking the lead and saying, whoa, we're going to put the brakes on this because these new studies are coming out that are showing the evidence of suicide later on in life based on these permanent types of procedures being done.
I mean, if you just think about it from a common sense standpoint, just being a parent, that children shouldn't make adult life-altering decisions while they're children. And that's simply what we're trying to do here. I mean, it's not any bigger than that. We're trying to regard those life-altering, life-changing decisions to when you are at the age where you can make that decision, and that is adulthood. And that's what we're trying to protect.
The other big headline continues to make headlines. It's been building. We talked about it last week. You were also asked about it by the State House Press Corps this week. The latest story that came out about Joe Biden potentially not making the November ballot in Ohio. We've been on record, you were on record as saying, well, really, this is something the Democrats can solve on their own. But the narrative has been, is the legislature, will the General Assembly, will Matt Huffman and the Senate Republicans bail out the Biden campaigns? And the latest story out of the Dispatch that I read on the 16th was that the attorney for the Democrats said the Democratic Party would provisionally certify Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris ahead of the August 7th deadline. But the Attorney General's office says you can't provisionally certify. And then there was a comment from Senator Bill DeMora saying we're still waiting on the DNC to tell us what we should do. Your message about this to the State House Press Corps on Wednesday was what?
Well, essentially, I mean, Joe Biden's going to be on the ballot, without regard to all of these machinations. The United States Supreme Court looked at the state of Colorado and said, you may have your interpretation of the insurrectionist clause, but you're not going to keep a candidate in a major political party off the ballot because of what you think that means. And that's consistent with other federal law, election law, whether it has to do with the U.S. Senate. We have this a lot with congressional redistricting. The federal courts will step in and say, states, you can't affect the election of federal officers. For example, when Ohio decided that they were going to impose term limits on congressional members in the 1990s, they did it along with the General Assembly, the U.S. Supreme Court said, can't do that, Ohio. Federal laws are up to the federal government, federal election. Now, you're going to implement the law. You got a Secretary of State and you want to be consistent with all of the other things that you do. We have this 90-day rule because they want to know so they can get the ballots printed up, all of the practical things that go along. But the federal court is not going to allow the state of Ohio to say you can't have Joe Biden on the ballot. That's just not going to happen. Whatever it is, the practical effect or how that has to happen, it's going to happen. And, as I understand it, we're waiting for the DNC to say, well, yeah, here's how we think it should happen. Whether that's legislation, I don't know what provisional means. In my mind, you don't have to wait. You don't have to have a convention to do that.
They just send a letter.
I think the National Democratic Committee could say, here's our candidate. I don't think there's anything in the Ohio Revised Code that prevents that. So, it's sort of I guess, an interesting story that it sounds like Republicans are going to keep Joe Biden off the ballot. That's false. It's not going to happen, but gives everybody something to talk about for a couple months.
Senate President Matt Huffman, Republican from Lima, State Senator Michele Reynolds, Republican from Canal Winchester. Thanks for all your hard work. Great to see both of you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you soon.